What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
My parents once looked me straight in the face and said, "You wouldn't enjoy Europe anyway," while they were literally zipping up luggage with my brother's initials stamped on the tags, and when they came back after 2 long holiday weeks. My room was empty and so was the safe, which is a sentence that sounds dramatic until you hear everything that led up to it and realize I did not explode. I just finally stopped playing along. I grew up understanding that my brother Evan is the headline act while I am the intermission, and if you think I am exaggerating, ask anyone who sat through our family dinners where Evan's college stories were treated like breaking news while my promotion was a footnote, and if I brought up student loans, they somehow became a lecture about how a strong attitude can overcome any balance, preferably without the family having to lift a finger. When my mom called with the big holiday announcement and used that tone she saves for charity events and church raffles, she said they were surprising Evan with a once-in-a-lifetime Europe trip over Christmas and New Year. And I honestly thought I was included because she said the word family 3 times in 1 minute, which felt almost like a legal definition. And I could hear my dad in the background telling the travel agent about seat assignments in first class, as if that detail needed a drumroll. I said that sounded amazing, and I asked which city we were starting in, because I have this little list on my phone of places I want to see someday, and she went quiet for a beat, then cleared her throat and delivered the line that should probably be embroidered on a pillow in their living room. "You wouldn't enjoy it anyway." She tossed in something about how I do not like long flights, and Evan deserves a break after a tough quarter, and I could tell from her voice that she thought I would make it awkward, so she wrapped it with, "We will do something nice when we get back," like a consolation prize that comes in the mail 6 weeks late and smells like regret. I did not cry, not right then, because there is a point where you realize that if you cry you're giving them the scene they already cast you in, the ungrateful one who ruins the vibe. And I have spent enough holidays being told to keep it light to know how that script ends. I said I hoped they had a great time, and I meant it in that brittle way people mean things when they are trying not to throw a plate. And I listened to my dad brag about a hotel points upgrade, while the little part of my brain that handles self-respect stood up from its chair and said, "Enough." After we hung up, I sat there for a while and thought about the year I had appendicitis, and they said the deductible was a little steep, so maybe I could wait a week. And the afternoon Evan got a speeding ticket and my dad drove across town to charm the clerk because Evan had an important meeting and could not miss his slot, and the time mom introduced me to her friends as the independent one, which is family code for the kid who buys her own cake. When they texted photos from the lounge with champagne in those skinny glasses that everyone pretends to like, I did what any supportive daughter would do. I tapped a heart and put my phone face down. Then I opened my notebook and made a list with 3 columns labeled what I own, what I owe, and what I will not carry 1 more inch. I am not a dramatic person by nature, but I am a thorough one, and I know how their house works, where the spare keys live, which contractors they hire, and which neighbor never asks questions because she loves feeling helpful. I know the rhythm of the alarm panel beeps because I heard them my whole childhood while we waited in the car, and I know the sound of the safe door because, years ago, my dad showed it off after a barbecue like a toy and joked that it was for family emergencies, which apparently had a very specific definition that excluded me. I called in a favor with a friend who runs a storage facility and booked a unit under my name with a long code that I memorized out loud while I walked circles in my tiny kitchen, and then I scheduled a moving van for the day after Christmas, which, in my family, is usually the day we pretend last night never happened and eat leftovers with a side of denial. I arranged for utilities at a new place that is not fancy, but is mine and does not require me to laugh at Evan's jokes, and I told my boss I needed 2 personal days, which she approved with a smile that looked like the kind of kindness I should have gotten at home. I backed up my files, labeled boxes with real words instead of scribbles, and set aside exactly 1 small box for things I would leave behind on purpose, because sometimes you have to demonstrate absence to people who only understand inventory. They sent a video from a cathedral that I am sure is very meaningful when you are standing under it. And I typed a sweet comment, and then I cleared out the top drawer of my dresser and the bottom shelf of my closet, and the part of my heart that still thought if I behaved perfectly, they might one day choose me, and, because my mother raised me to be polite, I watered her plants and stacked the mail and made sure the lights were on a timer so the neighbors would keep feeling helpful. When my dad called before their connecting flight and said, "We will bring you something nice," I said I appreciated it, and I meant it in that new way where appreciation no longer equals compliance. I did not slam a door, I did not write a manifesto, and I did not send a long text thread that would get screenshotted and passed around the family chat. I did something simpler and meaner to their hierarchy, which is that I accepted their choice at face value and decided to make one of my own, a choice that started with 3 phone calls and a signature and would end, very neatly, with space where my life used to be in their house and space where their money used to be in their safe. I wished them a safe flight. I meant every syllable, and then I picked up the pen, drew a line under the word enough, and began. When I say that I knew the safe better than anyone except my father, I am not exaggerating, because I grew up hearing the little bragging comments he would make about it whenever relatives visited, as if the existence of a steel box in the wall made him a more impressive man, and over the years I memorized details I was never meant to know. Like the fact that he thought keeping the same 4-digit code, since the day it was installed, was a sign of consistency rather than laziness. That safe was presented to me as an untouchable symbol of authority, always mentioned with the phrase, "family emergencies only," which sounded noble until I got older and realized that the emergencies were always Evan's problems. Whether it was a flat tire, a missed tuition payment, or the deposit for his new apartment after he broke a lease, while my own crises were brushed off with comments about learning responsibility or finding a cheaper option. When they left for Europe, I went into the house with a key I was never officially given but had been trusted with once when I was 17 and told to water the plants. And I made a copy back then because even at that age I already understood the way the deck was stacked. The alarm panel greeted me with the same tones it always had, and it was almost ridiculous how familiar it felt, like muscle memory reminding me I was still a member of this family whether they wanted to admit it or not. I went straight to my room first, not because I wanted to linger on nostalgia, but because I needed to pack every piece of myself out of that house, every trace of a daughter they dismissed, and I folded clothes, stacked books, gathered framed photos, and pulled down the few certificates I had hung up that no one ever acknowledged. Each item into a box felt less like packing and more like lifting bricks off my chest, because with every empty drawer I could feel myself stepping out of the role they had written for me. The safe was last, partly because I wanted to make sure I was not acting out of pure anger, and partly because I knew once I opened it there was no going back. I stood there for a long minute with my hand over the keypad, remembering the time my father showed it off to his friends after a barbecue, calling it his vault, saying it was where the family treasure lived, and how one of his friends joked that I should memorize the numbers in case of apocalypse, and how he immediately said, "She doesn't need to know," and closed the subject with a laugh that still burns in my ears. I punched in the code, listened for the heavy click, and pulled it open, and the sight was exactly what I expected: stacks of cash, envelopes, a few documents, and a bundle of receipts that no accountant would ever want to see. I knew some of that money was not completely clean, because I had overheard enough conversations about side deals and cash-only arrangements to know my father liked shortcuts, and that knowledge gave me a strange calm, because it meant they could never accuse me publicly without cutting themselves open in the process. I did not just scoop everything into a bag like some movie thief, because this was not about grabbing and running, it was about reclaiming. I counted, separated, organized, and made sure to leave behind anything that would directly tie me to a single transaction, because I wanted the hole in that safe to speak louder than any explanation they might try to spin. When the last bundle was tucked away, I closed the door, turned the lock, and stood back for one long moment, looking at the empty space that mirrored exactly how I felt whenever they compared me to Evan. My room was stripped, the safe was stripped, and for the first time I felt lighter instead of guilty. I moved everything into storage with the help of the friend who owed me a favor, and I signed the unit in my own name with my own lock and my own code. A symbolic gesture that made me laugh out loud in the parking lot, because it was the first time in years that I was the only one holding the keys. The money was not blown on some flashy purchase, not thrown into the wind for revenge, because this was not about proving I could live like they did for 2 weeks in Europe. This was about building a foundation where I did not have to beg or apologize or justify my existence. As I sat in my new apartment that smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibilities, I looked at the neat stack of envelopes I had carried out and realized they had no idea that every time they told me I was not enough, they were actually training me to be sharper, calmer, and far more prepared than they ever suspected. The irony was thick. They had spent years making sure Evan felt special by giving him everything, and in doing so they made me the one capable of taking everything away. When their plane finally landed and they sent me another smiling photo, my phone buzzed against the table where those envelopes sat in a tidy pile, and I stared at the screen knowing that within hours they would walk into that house and discover that their safe was as empty as their promises, and that the daughter they dismissed had finally stopped waiting for permission. They landed with those glossy smiles people practice on flights when they think the world is waiting to hear about their trip, and for a little while my phone lit up the way it usually does after a family vacation, with short videos of Evan doing tourist things and my mother narrating like a lifestyle blogger, while my father added running commentary about points and upgrades, and then the tone of everything flipped in a single afternoon when they walked into the house. Opened the door to my room, found nothing but the outlines where furniture used to be, turned toward the hallway, opened the safe, and finally understood that I had heard the sentence they delivered before they left and decided to start living by it. The first voicemail came from my mother, and it started with concern that sounded almost sincere, asking me to call because something looked unusual in my room and maybe I had moved things for painting. And before that message even finished recording, she must have opened the safe, because the next call was not concern at all. It was fury dressed as righteousness, telling me to stop whatever I thought I was doing and come home so we could discuss what she called a misunderstanding, which would have been funny if it were not so condescending. I let the calls pile up while I sat at my small kitchen table with the envelopes in a tidy stack and my notebook open to a page labeled Next Steps. And each time the phone buzzed, I thought about a past moment where I had been told to lower my voice or keep the peace or take the smaller slice, because that is what good daughters do, and I felt something in me decide that ignoring the calls was not childish or petty. It was strategy, because I understood that if they heard even a sliver of doubt, they would flood it with guilt and obligation until I was back in the familiar place where I apologized for breathing. Evan tried charm first, because he always does, texting that he could help smooth things over if I would just explain my little outburst, and when I did not answer he switched to the tone he uses with interns who do not jump fast enough, saying that what I had done was illegal and that Dad was already talking to a friend who knows a detective and that people go to jail for less. And I stared at that message for a long time and actually laughed because I knew something Evan did not know, which was that threatening to involve the police when your secret stash has never met a tax return is the kind of plan that folds on contact. When my father finally called, his voice had the hard shell he uses in negotiations, and he delivered a speech about family and obligations and consequences that had probably worked on vendors and contractors for years. And then he asked an almost casual question about whether I remembered anything inside the safe beyond the cash, which told me he had already taken stock and knew that his envelopes were not just missing but vulnerable. And that realization calmed me down in a way I did not expect, because if a man like my father is worried, then the leverage is real. I did not tell him that I had photographed the receipts and the handwritten notes, and I did not tell him that I had already met with a lawyer who explained, in a voice as calm as a winter lake, what happens when someone reports a theft and then has to explain the origin of unreported cash to an officer who has his own mortgage and incentives, and I did not tell him that I had placed copies of everything in a safe place, with a name not mine, because the game works better when the other side only sees shadows moving at the edges of the room. They came to my apartment and knocked until the neighbor across the hall opened her door and asked if everything was all right. And I let them stand there while I texted a single sentence that said the keys were in an envelope at the front desk and that all communication from this point forward should be in writing, and that any mention of the word theft would be forwarded to the proper authorities with documentation attached, and then I put the phone down and listened as the knocking softened. And then died, and the building went back to its normal sound of people minding their business. That night I prepared the smallest package I have ever assembled, a plain envelope with a single copy of one of the receipts that had the kind of handwriting a person uses when he thinks only friendly eyes will see it. Along with one short line that said, "Before you call anyone, consider how many questions you are prepared to answer," and I slid it into their mailbox without a return address because sometimes the most powerful answer is the one that refuses to show its face. By morning, the family chat was quiet in a way it has never been, and Evan sent a message that pretended to be helpful advice about returning what he called the disputed funds so that everyone could move on. And I typed a reply that thanked him for his concern and suggested that we could absolutely move on after a transparent accounting of who paid for what over the past many years, including the scholarships that were not scholarships and the rent that was not rent and the tickets that somehow evaporated. And I hit send and watched the typing bubble appear and vanish and appear again, which told me he was finally losing the script. My mother left one more voicemail that tried a different angle, telling me that I had always been the strong one and that strong people do not need to take what is not theirs, and she asked me, in a voice that trembled with anger disguised as sorrow, to come home and talk. And I deleted it because I had already come home once and found nothing there for me, except a role that required silence. I made one more move that day, not loud and not cruel, just clean and final, and I did it by sending a certified letter to my parents that included a calm summary of what I had taken from the safe, a list of the items I removed from my room, a statement that I considered the funds a reimbursement for costs I had carried alone for years, and a line that said any attempt to involve law enforcement would be treated as an invitation to provide full documentation to the tax people, with examples attached. And then I walked to the mailbox, dropped it in, and felt the building's hallway air settle around me like a verdict. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a message from my father that said we should meet and talk like adults, and that he wanted to resolve this before anyone else needed to be involved. And I smiled, because the word resolve is not one he uses when he thinks he holds all the cards, and I wrote back that I would meet at a time and place of my choosing, that I would bring a folder, and that he should also bring something important, by which I meant the truth he has never once spoken out loud. And while I typed that last sentence, I realized that, for the first time, he had no idea what I would do next, which is exactly how I wanted the next move to feel. I picked the place for the meeting the way you pick a dentist, not because you like the sound of the drill, but because you want someone who will finish the job without showmanship. So I chose a quiet diner where the waitresses call everyone honey and nobody looks twice at a folder on a table, and my father arrived in the jacket he uses for negotiating discounts he does not need. And he opened with a speech about how families stumble and recover and how reasonable people return what does not belong to them, while his eyes kept drifting to the folder by my elbow as if the paper inside it were a fuse waiting for a match. I let him talk, because silence makes him nervous, and when he finally ran out of metaphors about storms and harbors, I slid the first page toward him, which was a neat list in my handwriting of costs I had covered for myself since college. Things like medical bills and car repairs and tuition gaps that somehow fell through every crack, and then I added the photo of a receipt with his notes about cash withdrawals that were never going to meet a tax form, and I watched the color shift under his skin in a way I have never seen, not because he was scared of me exactly, but because the long comfort of being the only one holding the rulebook had just ended in the time it takes to slide a sheet of paper across a table. I told him I was not there to argue over definitions of theft or gratitude or family, because that road has more potholes than pavement. And I said that the money I took from the safe would be treated as reimbursement for years of costs that were mine because they decided they were mine, and that I would not be paying it back, not now and not on some payment plan that turns into a leash, and that in exchange for my silence regarding unreported cash and creative accounting, we would all move forward like adults who understand leverage instead of children who fling accusations and call it love. And for a long minute he stared at the table as if the laminate could produce a miracle. He tried the old trick where he says he needs time to review everything, which used to work on contractors who did not want to lose the job. And I said he could have all the time he liked because the copies were not going anywhere, and neither was the attorney who had already read them, and I watched him register the phrase "my attorney" and feel how different the world looks when your daughter stops asking and starts retaining. What I did with the money was, to him, probably the most insulting part, because I did not buy anything that could be dismissed as emotional shopping, and I did not take a single photo that could be mocked in a family chat. I paid every bill with my name on it so that the next emergency would not find me begging. I prepaid several months of rent on the small apartment that is now the only place I sleep in peace. I set aside a cushion with a financial planner who looked at my budget like a puzzle she could solve. I enrolled in a certification program that will make my work harder to replace and my pay much harder to minimize. And I put a retainer down with a therapist who does not flinch when I say the word favoritism like it is a splinter that has to be pulled all the way out. I told my father that part because I wanted him to understand that this was not a tantrum wrapped in cash. It was a plan, and the plan did not include returning to the role of the daughter who eats what she is served and smiles for the photo. Evan could not stand being left out of anything that smells like power, so he ambushed me outside my office like a sitcom villain who believes timing is a strategy, and he tried to loom in that way men think is persuasive, listing in a rapid stream the ways this could be handled if I stopped being dramatic and agreed to return at least half, and when I did not flinch he switched to the faux compassion that has always made my skin itch, telling me I was better than this and that I should not let resentment ruined my life, and I surprised both of us by laughing in a long, warm breath that made him step back, because I think he heard something new in it, something that sounded like I had already survived the worst thing he could do. I told him in a calm voice that whatever I returned to the family would be a list of past transfers labeled with who benefited and who paid, and that if he wanted to play with the word theft, then we could talk about the kind that wears a smile and gets called help, and the kind that hooks an arm through a parent while the other kid is told to be independent, and for once he did not have a snappy line waiting. My mother tried a softer approach that would have worked when I was 19, a message that said she missed me and that the house felt wrong without my things, and that surely there was a way to fix this without dragging outsiders into a private matter. And I typed back a message that thanked her for the honesty and explained that the outsiders existed because the insiders had never been neutral, and that the only way to fix anything was to stop pretending that the safe was a piggy bank with wings and start acknowledging who had been kept off the flight. That evening I sat at my small table with a cup of tea that tasted like quiet, and I wrote invitations in my head, not the decorative kind my mother loves with scripted fonts and useless flowers, but the practical kind that land in inboxes and cannot be misinterpreted, and I sent one to the family group for a Sunday dinner at their house with the subject line terms and conditions, and in the body I wrote that I would attend, that I would bring a folder, that I would outline exactly how we could put this to bed permanently without involving anyone in a badge or a blazer, and that I was also bringing a guest who asks excellent questions and writes accurate notes. And when I hit send, I felt the room change in that subtle way that tells you a storm has noticed your address, which is exactly the energy I wanted for the final move. Sunday dinner is not my ritual anymore, but I walked through that door with the folder under my arm and the guest at my shoulder. A quiet woman who makes her living notarizing documents and writing down exactly what people say when they think the room belongs to them. And I could feel the entire house holding its breath in that way, familiar to anyone who has ever walked into a family negotiation where the script used to be settled long before the actors arrived, only this time the script had teeth that were not theirs. My mother tried small talk the way people try a wet match. My father performed a welcome that felt like a controlled burn. Evan took the seat that gave him the widest view, as if angles could save him. And I let them arrange their faces while I placed the folder on the table and said, in a voice that did not shake, that we were going to finish all of this tonight without raised voices, without threats, and without pretending that the word family can erase a ledger written in years of selective generosity and strategic neglect. I opened the folder to the first document, which was a simple agreement that recognized the cash from the safe as reimbursement for medical bills, tuition gaps, housing deposits, and emergencies that I covered without assistance, while my brother received support under the banner of family necessity, and I explained that the sum I took was less than the total I could prove, but that I was not interested in a retroactive auction of affection. I wanted closure that could be read without a microscope and enforced without theater, and that is why there was a second page, a mutual non-disparagement clause that barred each of us from throwing accusations in family spaces or workplaces. because I knew how quickly a story like mine gets twisted into a tale about an ungrateful daughter who does not understand tradition. My father started the old argument about principle and honesty and how agreements should be made in private with trust, and I slid across the envelope that my guest had already sealed and stamped, addressed to the revenue people with a summary of the receipts and withdrawals he thought would never need daylight, and I said that trust had been the currency for far too long, and that tonight we were working with paper, signatures, and a clock that did not care about nostalgia. Evan tried to derail the room with an anecdote about how he had once paid one of my utility bills when I was starting out, a story he has polished into a legend of sacrifice. And I waited for him to finish, because interrupting him only makes him louder. Then I put down a photocopy of a text thread where he had asked Dad to pull cash from the safe to cover his speeding fine and his lease break. And I said that I was not here to embarrass him, but that I would not allow the meeting to pivot into myth-making that paints me as a taker while he remains the patron saint of good timing, and for once he had no rebound line because the evidence did not leave him room to swagger. My mother reached for the old soft power move where she asks for kindness in the name of holiday spirit. And I told her that I was showing more kindness than anyone had shown me in years by letting them sign an agreement that erased the need to discuss criminal exposure, future inheritance, and social fallout, and I watched her realize that the word inheritance had not crossed my lips once because the only legacy I wanted was quiet, stability, and the right to never again beg for fairness under a roof that confused love with convenience. The notary read the agreement aloud in that steady tone professionals use when they want a record that cannot be misquoted. My father interrupted twice to ask about phrasing that did not benefit him. My guest made small corrections that hardened the language instead of softening it. I added a final condition stating that any contact with me would be in writing unless there was a medical emergency. And I clipped to the back a short letter addressed to the broader family that acknowledged a period of difficult adjustments and asked everyone to refrain from gossip because we are resolving matters privately, which was the only olive branch I was willing to leave on the table because I know how cousins and aunts can turn a situation like this into a sport. When everything was ready, I placed a small timer I had already set in my head, a promise rather than a device, and I told them that if the documents were not signed before the hour slipped, my guest would walk straight to a mailbox with the envelope, and I would begin a process that none of us could stop once it left my hands. And my father looked at my face and recognized the part of himself he had always respected and never nurtured, the part that finishes jobs without flinching. They signed, one after another, with the notary watching and my hand on the folder, and in that stretch of minutes the house changed temperature because the old gravity was gone, and when the last signature dried, I took back the envelope and tore it in half over the trash can with a clean motion that was not a threat but a conclusion. Then I handed my mother a separate packet that contained the inventory of what I had removed from my room with a note that said I would not be returning anything, because I refused to live in a museum of expectations, and I placed my house key on the table without drama because I had already replaced it with a set that opens doors I paid for. My father wanted the last word, he always does, and he tried a small jab about how some people are not built for family travel and perhaps that is for the best, and I smiled in that slow way that says a door has closed forever. And I told him that he had been right in a way he never intended, that I do not enjoy trips where I am cargo and not a passenger, that I do not enjoy meals served with conditions, and that I will never again enjoy a version of family that uses the word love as a receipt. Which is why the story ends not with a toast, but with a ledger cleared and a hallway that did not echo when I walked out. I left with the folder and my guest and the agreement that now lives in a drawer next to my passport and my lease, real papers that represent choices I made for myself, and I did not look back because you do not need to admire a fire you have already contained. You just check the lock, turn the corner, and breathe the kind of breath that tastes like an afternoon with no phone buzzing and no voice endlessly explaining why you should understand. Maybe one day they will tell a trimmed version of this to friends who like moral puzzles. Maybe one day Evan will decide I was harsh and then, quietly, that I was correct. Maybe one day I will pick up a call out of curiosity and we will talk like people who know the same history from different angles. Or maybe the silence will stretch into something permanent and sturdy, and I will decorate it with peace. It does not matter tonight. Because tonight the final move worked the way I designed it to. Work, which is to end the argument, return the power to its rightful owner, and put a clean line under a sentence that started with "you would not enjoy it anyway" and ends with "I enjoyed watching the balance finally settle."